I was raised from the age of 3 by my father to believe that I was responsible. And much of my life, when I became more aware of what that meant, was to try to fulfill that task that literally doesn't or hasn't allowed me to sleep peacefully in over 15 years. And for me, one of the deepest things that motivates my life and motivates all the work of the Hartman Institute on so many different levels is that on our watch, the Jewish people shouldn't walk away from each other. That on our watch, it shouldn't just be okay to even think about the possibility of the two great communities of the Jewish people in contemporary life. 85% of the Jewish world, that it's even conceivable. Say, we're two separate people. We're not, I wish we would be conflicting with each other. We're not even doing that. We're not even ships sailing in opposite directions. We're in different oceans. And one of the things that we learned is that virtue, or Derech Eretz, is shaped by habit. There's also habit of speech. And it's not only acharei ha'peulot nimshachot halevavot, acharei hadiburim nimshachot halevavot, or nimshachim halevavot. When you talk and something's just, it's okay. I was at a conference where a very deep and close friend was able to posit the idea, Jewish people, and it's a 20th century American fabrication. There wasn't, and technically it's true. The term Jewish peoplehood, we didn't hear about it before, and no one used the term. I looked at him and I said, what are you talking about? Am Yisrael is a 20th century fabrication? Because the notion is, maybe it was a passé notion that we are somehow united with each other and it's just going to be fine. It's okay. And maybe the normal is not to be with each other. And there was just a short period in Jewish history where we had this commitment. We hear this discourse. It's all around us. What's fueling it is a very deep sense of hurt and of insult that many in each community are feeling towards each other. Sense of many North American Jews, predominantly liberal Jews, from modern Orthodoxy to conservative reform, reconstructionist, renewal, post-denominational, secular to nuns, feel that Israel is not acting with Derech Eretz. You're hurting me. Whereas a colleague of mine said, I feel I have a deep family relationship, but I feel it's an abusive relationship. And you want to get out. And that's understood. And what's interesting, over the last couple of years, there's an increasing sense of Israelis that you don't understand us. And that some of your comments and some of your positions also don't have the tzniut or the humility that Derech Eretz requires. And you can't build a people or sustain a people when we feel that way about each other. As I said, that so-called fait accompli, which more and more people are accepting, that story. And then when we add to it the changing of the generations, you feel that it's not that the train has left the station. For many people, it's already arrived, and it's just a question is when, not if anymore. That's not that is outside of the parameters of the Torah of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And it's also outside of the parameters of the pluralism of the Shalom Hartman Institute. The first given of this institute is Amech Ami. And we have to do everything in our power to make sure that in our watch, it's not only not weakened, but it's strengthened. I want to this evening talk about some of the issues that are deeply dividing us, in particular over the last year. As there's a sense that it's just getting worse. And when there's a sense that it's getting worse, that fits into that same narrative that we're in a direction that we can't, there's something happening that we can't prevent. I want to talk about some of those issues that are hurting us, hurting each other. In doing so, I want to do something different than I personally normally do, and that many people normally do here at the Hartman Institute. I want to share and speak about facts, knowing fully well that facts themselves are never agreed upon. But I want to speak about some facts, or my depiction of those facts. I then also want to analyze some of these facts, knowing fully well that once you get off of describing and you start analyzing, it becomes even more subjective and contentious. And I also not only want to speak about facts and analysis of facts, I also want to share with you opinions. And the challenge is that it's not always going to be clear when I'm claiming to be speaking factually, when I'm analyzing it and giving a take on it, and when I'm actually giving an opinion. And I'm aware of that confusion. And I will try, you will know it, but I want to remind you of a fundamental principle of teaching at the Hartman Institute. Despite our deep commitment to pluralism, we're not relativists. I know what it is that I know. However, what is always clear to me is that while I know what it is that I know, I never know if that which I know is true. And so I'm going to be very opinionated in the sense that I'm going to share feelings and ideas. But I know that my analysis of the facts, very often even the facts themselves or claims about the facts, let alone opinions, is meant not to convey a single direction of how, or the necessary direction of how we ought to proceed, but really thoughts of a person who is spending their life thinking about this and is struggling to understand and to redefine and ensure this collective life that I believe and here, I can say, ought to be committed to. But how is it possible? Is it possible that some of our understanding of the reality might be very, very different? Is it possible that some of the analysis of the reality might not be necessary? And even more significantly, is it possible that there are certain things that we could be doing that could be more helpful, not necessarily given the particular issue at hand, but given a commitment to making sure that in the long run, our people are still walking with each other? Now, it's clear to me tonight I would be giving a similar but different talk to Israelis. Tonight, I'm talking as an Israeli to you. And in that sense, it's not a symmetrical evening, because on the table is not, so what are they going to do? But I will be talking about what you could help to do to create the Israel that you want. One last clarifying introduction, which will then enable me to say anything that I want to say and get away with it. I love that fantasy. Is that my remarks aren't meant to give a larger vision of particular policy suggestions as to how to move Israel and North American Jewry on areas A, B, and C, or in a total vision of how we're supposed to move forward. In that sense, here I am a chassid of Uri. He thinks much of your dreams are my dreams, much of what you're pushing for, and we share a vision of what Israeli society should be. This is not meant, however, to be a larger meta conversation about the future, but to look at particularly and to limit myself to three areas and particular features of these three areas. The first is I want to look at some of the current issues of state and religion that are giving a sense that we are moving further away from each other. Two, I want to continue some of the remarks of Ilana last night and speak about the occupation, knowing fully well that the mere use of the category is contentious. In Israeli society today, outside of one newspaper, the word kibush is not used. It's not the way you describe the reality. But whether there is not an occupation of a land, I do believe, and I know that in stating so, I am already going from fact to opinion. I do believe that there is a people who are being occupied. And that issue and the very differing senses of Israelis and North American Jews on this issue, is there a way to create a little more understanding? And the third is on the impact of the culture of partisanship on the relationship between Israel and North American Jewry, where there is a sense that Israel is a red state and North American Jews are part of a blue state. And then what are the consequences of that and the rules that should govern it? Now, at the outset, it's on the one hand, it's really interesting that despite the issues that I want to focus on a religious level, Israelis and North American Jews are closer to each other than ever before. 15, 20 years ago, the great challenge was, how could we be one people when North American Jews define themselves as Jews and Israelis define themselves as Israelis? Well, Israelis no longer define themselves as Israelis. And it's not sure that all North American Jews define themselves as Jews. Israelis, the renewal movement, and many, so often you ask, how can we make a difference? How can we make a difference? We're not in control of the coalition. Anybody who says that, shame on you. In our lifetime, we've seen the opposite. The vast majority of Israeli Jews, without using the term, live lives profoundly similar to those of conservative reform, reconstructionist, renewal, post-denominational, secular North American Jews in their individual lives. So it's true, they don't belong to synagogues, but if you haven't checked recently, that's not a uniquely Israeli phenomenon. And many of the statistics, all the nuns, who belongs to where, we look at what people are doing. Liberal Jewish life is alive and strong in the state of Israel. Israelis are deeply and still deeply committed to democratic values. I know Ilana was speaking about Gam V'Gam, but we see only 19% of Israelis say Israel should be more Jewish and less democratic than it is today. These are cause you to pause. There was a recent statistic, and even if I take just the numbers themselves, even at their worst, headline, 60% of Israelis believe that we should not take North American Jews' opinions into account when it comes to issues of state and religion. Wow. We're further away than ever before. 40% of Israelis say we should. When you take out the Haredim from the factor, you're talking about half of Israelis believe that on my space in a country that you don't live in, I should take you into account. 22% say I should take you into account on issues of security and foreign policy. From my perspective, I wouldn't take you into account at all. 2% would be a statistic that I think should make sense. Why should you have any? Why should I even think about you in terms of whether my child should die or not? Over 20% still say I should. Over 40% say that I have to take you into account. So there's lots of numbers that are very confusing. But what's not confusing are a number of events. In particular, over the last year, the Kotel, which upset all of us very deeply, all of us, and we mourned it last year collectively. The sense that there is a conversion bill radically changing and creating a notion that now in Israel, you're not considered Jewish. And this language, you know better, but amongst your constituents, in Israel, my daughter, I'm not considered a Jew. Sense that over the last year or two, occupation has become celebrated in Israel. And that Israel doesn't express at all it's a different religion, let alone a different people. It's a different religion. So these are the issues that I'd like to talk about. Under the profound hope that you'll stop sleeping as well. Because maybe then I could sleep a little bit more. Now, to think about these issues, we have to put it in the context of Israeli political life. Because if we're going to look for a Derech Eretz together, a Derech Eretz which is Derech Eretz, we have to look at how do we treat each other in ways that are kind and gentle and respectful, and how do we also create a Derech Eretz? What is the reality, and how do we create functional solutions, functional paths to move forward? What paths don't help, what paths do? There are realities of the Aretz that we all have to recognize. In the color chart in front of you, intentionally mixing the blues and reds, which is done intentionally for many reasons. Number one, because I just like to change things up. But two, in Israel, the blue-red divide doesn't exist. You don't have somebody who, because they think that Abu Mazen doesn't want peace, therefore doesn't believe there's global warming. You just don't, it's like they're two separate issues. Separate issues. Abortion, separate issue. No discourse on gun control here. We all have guns. No issue. No debate. You could have somebody where we advocate gun control and do believe in global warming all at the same time. And there is nobody in Israel who's pushing for lower taxes. No political movement in Israel for lower taxes. Israelis believe taxes is part of our social responsibilities. You pay taxes, and they're high. There's no notion we want smaller government. That package of red and blue, it doesn't exist here. And in fact, many of the people on the political right are very much still sharing ideologies connected to democracy, connected to and living liberal Jewish lives. So you don't have this, here there is. There's this government elected by people, and here I do believe that the government deeply, deeply reflects the opinions of the population. That doesn't mean that every government policy reflects this is the government that Israelis want. It's not an accident. No one stole an election. This is what Israelis want, and our ability to fine-tune the parties we vote for gives Israelis a profound sense of empowerment. Now, the government might not necessarily reflect everything that Israelis think, but that's because Israelis might believe A or B or C, but might believe that A, B, or C is number 7 on a list of priorities and might pick something else. And so there might be differences between policies of the government and the population on a number of issues. But make no mistake, this is a government by the people. Not only is it a government by the people, if you do a careful analysis of Israeli polls and elections over the last 10 years, and the one who you saw at first was when Tzipi Livni and Kadima couldn't form a coalition. I would argue that part of what we have to understand, and here I'm taking fact and now analyzing. In my analysis, there is no possibility for a center-left government to be formed in the current Israeli constellation. Meaning that the coalition that you now see is strong and stable, and barring one or two counterfacts. A, if Netanyahu gets indicted, but almost every poll shows that Gideon Sa'ar would get more votes, and I would argue that it doesn't matter who's at the head, but that might change. Or a significant American peace plan would require a different constellation, because the core coalition that is in place would no longer be able to sit with each other, in which case neither the blue nor the red could form a coalition in isolation, and then things might change. But as they are now, this coalition is remarkably stable and can't be replaced. Why? A, the Likud, and number one, number 2, 3, or 7, I don't know anymore, but there is a remarkable consistency in the blocks and in the core numbers. They might change 4 or 5 here or there, depending on the poll, but most of the changes are within the blocks. So there could be a new party coming up. She takes votes away from Kulanu because she's competing on a similar idea. Or you could have the Likud going down and the Religious Zionist Party going up, primarily in polls. The more closer you go to an election, the Likud grows back, because people want to make sure that the Likud's large enough to form that there isn't even a threat to a counter coalition. Why is this coalition so stable? And we have to understand the inner part of it. And when you understand it, then we could begin to think about, so what does that mean about us? Because if our plan for the salvation of our relationship with Israel is the resurrection of Yitzhak Rabin is not going to be resurrected, and even if that miracle occurred, he would not be able to form a coalition. the center left, mathematically, for close to 10 years, cannot form a coalition. Even if you could imagine a coalition of Yesh Atid, Zionist Union, and Meretz, and ignoring the fact that Yesh Atid has said, I won't sit with Meretz. So let's say we'll just ignore that. And then you add to this unique coalition, which at least in theory cannot exist, Lieberman, the great white liberal hope of Israeli society. And Kulanu, you still don't have a majority without the Haredi parties. And the Haredi parties are not going to join a coalition of Yesh Atid, Meretz, and Lieberman. Or they won't join such a coalition if they have an option for another, which in fact they do. And that other is stable and delivers. What changes the equation is the 13 seats of the Arab parties, which are not available to the center-left for the forming of a coalition. And even if Meretz, Lieberman, etc., are not going to sit, even if they would, but the parties themselves, the positioning of the Israeli, Arab, Palestinian parties in this united list has a significantly anti-Zionist rhetoric, which makes them non-coalition partners, at least for the foreseeable future. In a way that it might be more likely for Meretz and the Haredim to agree on a draft bill than at least for the next decade to assume a complete change in the Arab parties, which would make them be able to be integrated within a Zionist coalition. You might ask, so why shouldn't Netanyahu? Doesn't he see? Netanyahu cares about world Jewry, and he truly does. He cares about democracy. The protector of world Jewry and democracy for years in the Israeli government was always Netanyahu. He was always the mature adult. So why doesn't he get rid of this Jewish home, and why doesn't he get rid of the Haredi parties and just sit with one partner, Yesh Atid, and life would be much better? Here you have to remember two very important features of Israeli politics. The first is any coalition of Likud, Yesh Atid, and the Zionist Union is a coalition amongst parties, each one of whom believes they should be the prime minister. And therefore, it is an inherently unstable coalition. The moment it is formed, the hourglass is turned over. It's just a matter of time. Because at the end, Yair Lapid or Gabay, I should be prime minister. The Likud will always prefer coalition partners who either have no claim, no desire, or nor chance to lead. And in this way, their leadership and hegemony is clear. The Likud will also prefer parties like the Haredi parties who don't have a clear foreign policy agenda. Netanyahu believes, and most Israelis believe, that he is the most significant asset for Israel's long-term security needs. And so parties which don't have long-term security agendas are perfect coalition partners. Not to speak of the fact that while the Haredim in the past, under Ovadia Yosef and under the Rav Shach, used to be foreign policy doves, have over the last decade moved very significantly to become foreign policy hawks or security hawks. And therefore, their most natural place to live is in the Likud party. All of the above creates something that Israeli society didn't have in the past, and that is stable governments. We used to have elections every 2 years. And now, even if we have elections, they're not meant to change the coalition. They're maybe meant to change some of the platform of the coalition. So if under this coalition I had to agree, if I create a new election, you know that I'm only going to join if you agree that. And so I am just upping my bargaining power, which you might forget in a given coalition. So from time to time, I'm going to create a new election, cost X millions of dollars, and then at the end, it's going to be the exact same thing all over again. Now, if that's the case, and under this environment, in Israel, it used to be that different parties sat with each other. And who was a Zionist, not a Zionist? You sat with each other. You built coalitions with each other. Now, there is a stability in the coalition. And thus, there are increasingly clear lines as to who is in and who is out. Who's a party with you and who's not party with you. And in this environment, there is some beginning in Israeli society of the blue-red divides that you have, with one or two interesting exceptions. The first is that here, the blue-red divide, there is one party, one color, who's going to be in power for quite a while. There isn't the possibility. You don't know who's going to win the next American election. I know who's going to win, who's going to form the next coalition in Israel. Opinion. Close to fact. Two, there isn't the inherent check and balance of the United States between the presidency and Congress. And where very often you can vote for one and you want them to cancel each other out. Here, there is no check and balance within the political structure, which leaves the only check and balance to be in the judiciary, in which the Supreme Court serves as a check and balance. But beware, when a Supreme Court has to alone serve as a check and balance and doesn't have within the government the possibility of leadership change or an internal check and balance, there is an increased feeling that the court is exceeding its mandate and becoming or creating a dictatorship of the court, which leads to a rise in Israel of those who have the power to pass the laws, the inclination to pass laws inhibiting the right of the court to override the votes, or the laws of the Knesset. This issue will be addressed more fully when, I'm blanking, next week, former Chief Justice of the Israeli court is going to come speak to you. Banish is going to come speak to you about this issue. So with this rather lengthy introduction, but it's really important because if this is what is, then what do you do? Let us all stop for 1 second and be profoundly amazed at my technological abilities. I am amazed. I don't remember a greater sense of insult than the issue of the Kotel. There was betrayal, dishonesty, a sense that, where's your Derech Eretz? How could you throw out that which you yourself initiated and agreed on? And that, more than many issues, has caused the sense that we are moving impossibly apart. let's go back to just some of the core basics. And I just want to be really clear. What is it? It's true. There was a betrayal. It's true. The language was insulting. It's true. We tasted something. It's you tasted a change. What was it that we tasted? Let's look at it. For a long time, there was a kotel. That kotel wasn't a shul. Wasn't allowed to be a shul. It was surrounded by garbage. And if Jews were allowed one day to go, they could stand there. And as every individual, you could stand and pray if you happened to be in a decade or in a year where it was allowed. In 1967, this kotel is liberated. And what changes isn't the kotel, because the kotel's the kotel. What changes is the area in front of the kotel. And instead of being a small little pishy area, it now becomes a large area for prayer. And in addition to a large area of prayer, what's most important as for our discourse is that there is a huge plaza. Let's call it the Kotel Plaza. And more important than the Kotel Plaza has the security gate. Now, once the Kotel becomes larger and Jews could pray there, now the original sin of Israeli society gets activated. The original sin on issues of state and religion in Israel is that Israelis adopted the millet system of the Ottoman Empire and thought that Jews only have one millet. Jews could be served. There could be 11 different Christian millets, but there's only one Jewish millet. And this is part of the original sin, not merely of the religious of Israel, but of the secular Israelis, who didn't say, hello, I have a millet too. I have a way that I, as a secular Jew, want to be married. And since there weren't conservative Reform Jews here, there were no counter millets. So we had one millet. And under that millet, the minute the kotel becomes a shul, there's a division between men and women. It becomes basically under the governorship of the Orthodox Rabbinic. This was the original place. It then got moved slowly over the years. I do have the technological prowess to change it. But since the time is getting late, we'll focus on, we'll let that be just our little break as we delve in deeper. Without getting into the extensive history that you all know of how Women of the Wall and a coalition of liberal Jews and feminist Orthodox Jews created the impetus and pushed the courts to say, is the Kotel really a synagogue? And the Supreme Court deciding it's not a synagogue and therefore everybody should be allowed, but come up with another solution. And lo and behold, a Hanukkah miracle occurs in which the pach shemen, the oil, which could only last for one day, lasted for 8. And all of a sudden we discovered that the Kotel has more the Kotel. I don't know how to draw an arch. It's pathetic, but it'll do. And the Supreme Court already with Chesed in 2003 says, if you don't find more Kotel, this kotel is going to be the kotel of the Jewish people because it doesn't belong to the millet. It's not a synagogue. And it's only Alon, in the minority opinion, who says this is a synagogue and should be governed by the laws protecting holy sites. It's not a synagogue. I'll let it be a synagogue if you deal with and come up with a solution for others. And so, a new kotel is born. Both of them are part of the kotel. What was it that ultimately was going to be so revolutionary about the Sharansky deal that was negotiated? Is that there was going to be the kotel, with two parts to it. An Orthodox part and a liberal part. And they were both going to be the kotel. And even more significantly, there was going to be one plaza. And you come through the gate. And you could go here or you could go here. What basically Sharansky hoped, or what the deal that was pushed through, whether it was the plaza or more significantly, the security gate. There was going to be the security gate of the kotel. This is the, what is it called? A magnometer of the kotel. One, all Jews equally, not governed by the millet. And ultimately, through this, we were going to transform and overcome the original sin of Israeli society. Because now, for the first time, we were going to recognize that there are two Jewish millets. And by having one security gate and one plaza, that was going to create equality in which, free at last, it was finally going to be the type of Israel we wanted. But herein we have to go back to the coalition agreement. And what every Israeli government signs with the Haredim is that on this government, we will not change the status quo. Now, it's really a complicated term because what constitutes the status quo that you're not going to change has no objectively written statement. In some cases, it's the status quo in law, and sometimes it's the status quo of Derech Eretz, of how the country has conducted itself over the number of years. Any time a Haredi party will argue that you're changing the status quo, every Israeli prime minister will recognize that they have to accept that argument. And in fact, this was a change of the status quo. It was. Now, why were we so excited? Because we knew it was changing the status quo. And what made us even more excited is that we did not remember. The majority of Israelis, the issue of the kotel is number 14 in their top 10 priorities. It's number 4. This is not what they wake up. And in this Middle East, you could understand. Issues of state and religion, there are other issues that they care about. The most significant issue that they care about, which is your issue, which you've been trying to push, is the issue of marriage. There's a strong Israeli interest. The kotel was not their interest. You think you're going to change the status quo from the top down? Well, we were this close. There's no reason not to feel upset at a victory that was snatched from our hands at the last moment. But it's important for us to understand that the issue that we are threatening Jewish unity with the state of Israel about is one that I would argue is the result of our desire to shortcut a much more lengthy process. What changed, and I know there's issues of which rabbi sits on which committee, etc., In the New Deal, what changes is there is no more the security gate. There's another security gate. And the other thing that changes is there no more, we don't share the plaza. There is no access. And there'll be a second plaza. And so, in fact, and this is where Israelis, here you're acting to me without Derech Eretz, etc. Even the Supreme Court, there is the Kotel Plaza, and here there will be a Kotel Plaza. Who has the Kotel? It depends who you ask. But the government of Israel, nor the Supreme Court, is not going to legislate that the Kotel belongs to the Jewish people when they could create a reality where there is a Kotel. And if you want this to be the Kotel, it's not going to come from the top down, it's going to come from the bottom up. Is this here? There's an analysis. But I would ask you, is this what we get divorced about? I know immediately after the event we were angry. Is this the tool? Is this what we get divorced over? Do we allow this? Do you know how we win here? You see this plaza of a kotel? Do you know what it's like almost every day of the year, ladies and gentlemen? Who knows? It's empty. You want to make this the kotel? You're not going to get the Supreme Court or the government to agree. The coalition requires the Haredim, and the Haredim are going to say, I'm not changing the status quo whereby I determine as the millet. That's the original sin. I'm not denying it. You want to change it? Then every single liberal shul in Israel has to put a moratorium on any bar mitzvahs in their shul and say every single one of them has to be at the kotel, at our kotel. This is going to be the kotel which is alive. This is going to be the one that's filled with people. This is where music is going to come forth. Let us show that this is the kotel. But it will only happen if Israelis decide this and if they transform it. It's perfectly legitimate to hope that somebody else will fight our battles for us. It's perfectly legitimate to be angry at Netanyahu for changing his mind. But at the end of the day, our job is to fight for the Israel we want. And in the current coalition, other than a Supreme Court which increasingly finds itself and its hands shackled, and is increasingly shackling itself out of fear of the consequence of a legislation that goes too far, which would then give birth to a counter legislation, which would undermine the Supreme Court's power to even determine or override a simple majority of 61 in the Knesset. That's on the table. If you want to win, you don't win through legislation, and nobody's going to win for us. We are in the midst of decades-long wars or battles over the type of Israel that we want. We might have yearned for shortcuts, but in this political environment, those shortcuts are impossible. And no Israeli prime minister, whether it was Netanyahu or Yesh Atid or Gabay, none of them, anyone who would require the Haredim are going to keep the status quo. We could win, but we're going to win if we engage in a marathon. But if we claim or allow a narrative of profound betrayal to take over, there is no desire to even fight or run that marathon anymore. And I ask you whether we should do so. My opinion and my prayer is that I don't believe we should. Let's make our kotel the most vibrant kotel because we have convinced Israelis that that's where they want to be. The conversion law. Here it's more complicated because the status of conversion in Israel is not regulated by law. The status quo is Derech Eretz, not law. Derech Eretz, not in the sense of decency. It's not decent at all. It's just the way of the land. The way of the land is that the rabbinate performs the conversions. The way of the land is that conversions outside of Israel, regardless of any denomination, get you recognized under the law of return. While the law of return does not recognize Jews converted here in the state of Israel. Since there is no law of the land, there is no legislation, there's only a status quo of conduct. This has been relatively stable. If you want to change it, either the Haredi parties will argue, you're changing the status quo, or if a Supreme Court pushes it too far, it faces the possibility of a legislation to silence the Supreme Court. Now, as you all know, there have been petitions in front of the Supreme Court now for a number of decades to recognize that this, since it's not legally required, what is the grounds for accepting only one conversion? Now, the argument which holds sway amongst many Israelis enhancing this status quo is the notion, a false one, but it's a very common notion, that one people requires one conversion. Even though legally the millet doesn't have control, there is a sense that if we can't convert together, we won't be able to marry each other. And so there is a very strong public support for maintaining a status quo. That public support is beginning to break down because with the natural birth rate of the Jewish, non-Jewish Russians, together with New Aliyah, we have 8,000 to 10,000 additional non-Jews, according to any denomination, living in Israel every year. And the rabbinate's conversion process being one that requires of everybody who converts to become Orthodox only allows or only enables 2,000 to 3,000 people to walk through its doors. So the problem is getting worse and worse. There is now 10% intermarriage rate in Israel. And the problem is there. Now, in order to respond to this problem, there was a separate from the Supreme Court cases, which are just waiting because the Supreme Court knows that there is no legal foundation to not allow multiple conversions of other denominations in Israel. Barak has spoken so. It's there. They're just waiting. But the Supreme Court is also not rushing to give the ruling because they know the consequences of it. Because this will be conceived as a radical status quo. And the government says, wait, we're going to try this, we're going to do that. And there were various attempts to find different solutions, including willingness of liberal denominations to pull and to keep those rulings on, put those petitions on hold. Whether it's the conversions of conservative reform or alternative ultra-Orthodox conversions. But in light of the outcry of the reality of this 400,000 people and growing who can convert, within the rabbinate there was an inner revolt. Within the millet, there were those who saying, I'm not starting a new millet, I'm the same millet. But who said you control the millet? I control, why can't I be? You made me a rabbi, I'm a rabbi of a city, I'm kosher. I'm part of the millet. Who said that you control what every rabbi in the millet does? We can have an alternative conversions in Israel. Now, if the Supreme Court on this ruled and said their conversions, as distinct from the other cases where they said, we're going to rule, we're going to rule, we're going to rule, here they ruled. Now, once the Supreme Court recognizes multiple conversions within the millet, there is you've now broken the cultural status quo, and there is no havamina or even any thought to imagine that other conversions would be illegitimate. And again, too, from the top down, we would break the millet system. And now there would be multiple millets. Here, since there is no law, it's again very, very tempting. And again, the government says, wait, we're going to come up with a new commission. And the new commission basically to come forth with the legislation, because the Supreme Court says there is no law, and on the basis of the law, multiple, so give me a law. And the Supreme Court says, I'll wait to have a new law, and the new law came forth. And the new law basically said, now by law, only Orthodox conversions are going to be acceptable. But in reality, while a change in law, it's not a change in the cultural foundations of the status quo. And here too, in this government, it's fine to try. God bless you for trying. We should all try. And one of the goals of turning to the Supreme Court is not even to win in the Supreme Court. Very often, it's to create greater public awareness of how issues of state and religion are infringing on your life and harming Israel as you know it, on issues that you care about. And Russians, this is something which is higher than the Kotel. Still not high, but it's already higher. It doesn't have the status of civil marriage and of freedom of marriage and divorce, but it now cares more. If the law would pass, it would be fine. But we know that if the law would pass in this government, there would be a counter. If the Supreme Court would rule, there'd be a counter ruling, and then there would be a much deeper breakdown because, again, the Supreme Court can't be the sole check and balance. But let's remember two important things. Anytime we hear people state, Israel doesn't recognize me as a Jew, it's really important that we not accept that language. It's true. Original sin of Israel has created a rabbinate which allows for profound legal and cultural discrimination against liberal Jews. Israel is not fulfilling its role as the homeland of the Jewish people. It's not. But right now, Israel, in fact, not the rabbinate, Israeli society, in every significant issue or in every significant parameter of social life, has what is probably the most liberal definition of Jewishness of almost any society in Jewish history. Anybody who self-defines as a Jew, from every significant parameter in Israeli life, not the rabbinate. You want to know where it's really important? Where are you allowed to send your kids to kindergarten? Where are you allowed to, who will rent you an apartment? Where are you allowed to buy a house? Are you allowed to serve in the army? Anyone who self-defines as a Jew and doesn't belong to another religion basically is accepted as a Jew within Israeli society. It's true, the rabbinate, we're still stuck within this. You know how it's going to change? It's not going to change through legislation. It's not going to change through a Supreme Court ruling because that will get overturned. Paradoxically, the rabbinate is right now on its last breath. It actually serves our society well for it to continue to try to have complete control over issues of personal status. Because the marketplace is already talking. Here, Israelis actually care. Israelis more and more, I'm not getting married in the rabbinate. Why? If I don't want to be subject to the rabbinate, I don't need to go. Do you know how many marriages I perform outside of the rabbinate? A whole world. We started a rabbinic school. Hundreds of people, liberal rabbis, Orthodox, are performing marriages. I don't want to be in the rabbinate. The marketplace is speaking. The marketplace, since you don't have an answer for conversion, the marketplace is speaking. Conversions are taking place. It's actually paradoxically strengthening liberal Jewish denominations here. Trust the marketplace. Takes longer. But Israel is not now further away or moving away from liberal Jewish values. The narrative that the Kotel and the transformation of the conversion bill are just further evidence of Israel moving away, I would ask you to think or to question that premise. What is true is that we tasted a legislative victory or a victory coming from the top down. And we're going to have to work much, much harder. Much, much harder. It's not the government or the Supreme Court, Uri, that's going to give in Israel the document about what constitutes a Jewish society that you and Mark Angel put together. It's not going to come, no one's going to legislate that. It's going to have to come from the bottom up. Do we have the energy and are we creating the sustained commitment to Israel to fight and to create that Israel? And what frightens me is that over the last year, we have weakened the coalition that we can build together to change the Israel that we have. Briefly, the occupation. It seems, I guess especially when you connect it together, state and religion, occupation, settlements, as if there is a coalition creating a Judaism and a society more and more foreign to everything that you care about. It's a society which is not only insulting me, it is a society in which Derech Eretz is lost, not only towards Americans, but your Derech Eretz towards Palestinians. There are people suffering. You don't want to call it an occupation, but there's a people here. And you don't want to talk about it. Israelis are becoming fascist, anti-democratic. Every statistic shows that that's not the case. Ilana Dayan calls it gam v'gam. But what I ask you to add to the equation of your reflection on the issue of occupation is not that the Israelis no longer feel that it's illegitimate to occupy another people, but that Israelis do not feel that it is in their power to change that reality. It's not that the occupation has become kosher. And it's not that the two-state solution is no longer a goal. But there is no understanding. And you heard it in Ilana Dayan, and I see it in my own policies. I am a pro-Palestinian Zionist. I yearn for a Palestinian state, not because I want a majority of Jews in Israel, but because I want for Palestinians what I have for me. What's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. If I see myself as a people, and I believe that I have an inalienable right to be free and to be sovereign, how could I deny that from somebody else? I yearn for a Palestinian state. I do not know anymore how to create it. Now, there is still, in particular in North America, less in Israel. How could you give up the two-state solution? You're destroying Israel as a Jewish democracy. That's further evidence that you're moving away from what we care about. You're giving up on democracy. Well, I want to ask you a question. When was the last time Israel made a major foreign policy move in order to ensure that Israel is a Jewish democracy? When? You know. Say it. When? Gaza. 2005. In 2005, the argument which convinced Sharon to change, this was Olmert's able to turn Sharon away from his prior policies, is to recognize that actually holding on to Gaza undermines Israel's security because Israel's security has to take into account our commitment to have here a Jewish majority. Now, in light of the Gaza experience, and you turn to Israelis and say, we need to have a Palestinian state, because we have to maintain Israel as a Jewish democracy. The very reasonable answer, not from 6,000 to 10,000 miles away, but from here, is to say, what are you talking about? You want me to have a Gaza in Judea and Samaria? I want a Jewish democracy, but even as Aaron Barak on another case, when he argues on the issue of inalienable rights of terrorists and can you torture, he says inalienable rights only exist within the context of a society. And you can't require an inalienable right which will undermine a society. So I said, you know what? In this neighborhood, that's correct. I don't know. I will be, if this is my destiny for the next generation, I will live, but I prefer to live than to, in fact, you tell me. I want a two-state solution and I find it completely coherent, but I have just one small question. Could you please tell me what that second state is supposed to be? If you could give me an answer of what that second state is supposed to be, under which I will then preserve Israel as a Jewish democracy, I will go to the next stage. Until which time that you don't tell me, because what I see there is Gaza, what I see there is Lebanon. I'm living in a neighborhood where there is not one single functioning democratic Arab country. And the only ones which work, whereby the trains run on time, is when there are profound dictatorships. So you tell me what I should do. The argument of a Jewish democracy doesn't work on ground zero. Because what am I supposed to do? Do you think I'm going to have a stable government there? Okay, you could argue that I would, but it's at least legitimate for people to assume that I won't. And under those conditions, it's not that I don't care about democracy, but what happens if my national rebirth, and I'm not saying that I'm perfectly guiltless for the reality. I might even be very guilty. Right now, will Judea and Samaria turn into Gaza? It's at least profoundly plausible that it is, in which case it's not that Israel doesn't care about democracy. It's just that we don't have the ability to implement a peaceful solution which will enable that. And so what I need to do is here, maintain a status quo. What I have to start talking about is, maybe I create some form of autonomy in area A and B. And actually, paradoxically, it is the discourse over a two-state solution that has removed from Israeli society any significant discourse of our moral responsibility to Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria. Because my responsibility is exonerated by saying what? I want to give you a state. I want a two-state solution. But what happens when your solution to a moral failure is something that you know cannot be implemented in your lifetime? And so Israeli society actually, under the unimplementable two-state solution, has completely lost all moral discourse about Palestinians. So there's a few, there's this organization and Haaretz and Gideon Levy writes about it, but frankly, they have become transparent, not because we transparentize people, but because you're living in a reality where you don't have a solution. And Jewish democracy is not a sufficient counterweight given the alternative that might result or that will very likely result. And finally, in this political environment, I feel good. In this political environment, Israel is creating political divides between a stable coalition and an increasingly irrelevant opposition. An opposition that could pass or could make from time to time a little trouble, but basically is not able to force election or to change a legislative agenda or put forth an alternative legislative agenda. And even if they could on the issues that I just raised, remember, Yesh Atid, Lapid's most peaceful statement was, I want a peace agreement so that I don't have to see them. That was his dramatic peace statement. That's as far as you go. In this reality, we, and I use the word we because I'm here, I'm in the United States and Canada 3 months a year. I have a divided soul. I don't know you, I am you. Part of my pain at this is when I see your pain. It's unacceptable that Israelis don't understand it sufficiently. But still, there are at least 40% of Israelis, at least, who on issues of Israeli legislation want to talk to you, feel that we're part of the same family, feel that we have a responsibility to each other. What is it that we need to do in order to strengthen that? So on the one hand, I spoke about the need to give up the fantasy of victory from the top down and to go back to the slow work of the bottom up and not to allow a discourse that undermines our ability to keep on course. And that's right, for 2,000 years we prayed for a country and it's going to take us another 70 years. And you hoped for a victory, it's going to take another 70 years. I'm there. I won't be alive, but I'm there. Are you there? I'm there, I promise. And there's a whole army of people who are there. Within your movements and within religion, within renewal, throughout this country, build them, they're there. Strengthen that 40%. Pick the issues that you think could win. Help slowly to shape that society. But in this political environment, there's something that you have to be very, very careful about. It's very, very easy, just as you could see Israel as red, that Israelis begin to see you as blue. And when Israelis see you as blue, you become politically irrelevant to Israeli society. And instead of advocating for the Israel you want, if you are perceived as advocating for a particular political party, your voice becomes irrelevant in Israeli society. Now, there's nothing wrong advocating for a particular political party, but know that in this context, that's not going to happen. And therefore, it pays to be judicious. It pays to think. It also pays for someone who doesn't live in a particular country to ask to what extent and how vociferously I could advocate for governmental change. Or the ability or the recognize that those in power aren't going to appreciate it that much. Jerusalem was actually a really important issue. 80-something% of Israelis were happy that the embassy was moved. I was happy. On a scale of 1 to 10, I was happy at 2. But I was happy. I always knew that Jerusalem was the undivided capital of the Jewish people for now and all eternity. I know that. Everybody learns how to swear it every morning. You wake up before Shema Yisrael. Of course Jerusalem is mine. Of course Jerusalem is the capital. Do I like the fact that America recognized it? Sure I do. Of course. But when on that issue you comment, then all of a sudden Israel says, what? Are you Meretz? How could you argue that Israel has to take a policy of Jewish peoplehood when you are engaging in partisan politics in Israel? We live in a difficult time where if you don't tweet regularly, it's as if you don't exist. It's difficult. How do institutions exist? How do we speak to our people? The speed of information, the need to comment, the need to be a leader and to be out there are very, very profound. But in this political environment, when it comes to Israel, we need, I believe, to be more thoughtful. Because you will never influence Israeli society when Israelis believe that it is you who don't care about Jewish people. Where it's you who don't have a larger vision of responsibility, and whether you merely represent a particular political party without even some of the humility that a 6,000 to 10,000 mile distance should require. There are many ways that we're going to change Israel, or there are many ways that we hope that we're going to change Israel. I am for all of them. Those who want to work through Supreme Courts, those who want to work from the bottom up, all of the above. I don't know who's going to work and what's going to be more successful. This institution is committed to a bottom-up strategy. This institution is committed to putting rabbis and educators and people on the ground in every single corner of Israeli society. That's our methodology. I welcome the fact that there are people and institutions who think that I'm completely wrong, and great. Let all of us together, as long as we share a vision of the Israel we want, who knows what's going to win. But I ask of you to consider and to think. If under our watch it is forbidden for the Jewish people to walk away from each other, it is forbidden for us to accept it as Derech Eretz, a notion that we are just destined to be apart. If that is not our Derech Eretz, what are our responsibilities? I have certain answers or suggestions. I don't care if you agree with me. That's not the point. My prayer and my request is that you ask that question and ask yourself what policies you personally should adopt, not to create victory, but to ensure that the Jewish people don't walk away from each other. Thank you. Now, just if you noticed on the schedule, I knew this was a little longer. We wrote till 10. We'll take 15 minutes of questions. Those of you whose tushis are done, I appreciate it. Yes, David.
There's a piece in the critique of the American Jewish community not being involved in Israeli partisan politics or supporting a political party that I find to be inconsistent with what we experienced from the Netanyahu government, Bibi himself, and the minions who support him as to what took place in the United States when he appeared before Congress without the proper type of protocol with the President of the United States and the incredible, vocal and active support for Republican partisan politics that take place by the most partisan of all Israeli supporters.
Right. I did not say, I'm with you, David. Yeah, but I'm not talking, who said there needs to be a quid pro quo? When Netanyahu got involved in American politics, he did more disservice to Israel and your relationship with Israel. So because he did it, doesn't mean we should do it. Now here too again, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't personally. Sheldon Ellison is involved in Israeli politics. I'm talking when the American Jewish community as a group are perceived to belong to the opposition, then you enable a silencing of your voice in the discourse. Now, use Netanyahu as a perfect example. How did you feel when he did that? So it's, of course, that quid pro quo, it's not fair. I'm asking you we have to fight against it. We need a bipartisanship. You can't have individuals, sure. The fact that individuals, North American Jews, have opinions and want to get involved in the Israeli political process, go for it. Buy a newspaper, do whatever you want. But it's when there's the totality, the 80%, it's when you speak, it's olim b'choma, we're one group. And know, as you know very well, how disruptive, how you felt, that's how disruptive and destructive Israelis feel. Okay? Yes, please.
You talked about the difficulty with a solution to the Palestinian state. So can you address the issue of settlements?
Now, in the issue of settlements, the vast majority of Israelis believe that settlements aren't the hindrance to peace. Why do they believe that? See, if What happened in Gaza? When we wanted to get out of Gaza, we knew that the settlements were a hindrance to peace. But settlements can't be a hindrance to peace if peace is unachievable. So peace would have to be achievable for people to analyze settlements as a problem. So it's not, what happens is you have a coalition between those who want to settle and those who realistically say, okay, I realize that settlements, maybe we shouldn't have, that's not the, but right now, is that the problem? And for Israelis, it's just not the problem. Does that justify building new settlements? No, it does not. There too, in this coalition, the coalition between the religious and the ultra-Orthodox and the Likud are a coalition of people for whom settlements is not only not a hindrance to peace, but it is our responsibility. So obviously it is a problem. It depends on your perspective. But outside of the coalition, peace has to be an option, a realistic option for settlements to be a hindrance. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we're going to end, just so that everybody could sort of, and then that'll be menschlich. Yes, please. Yeah. Either.
I understand, vis-a-vis the religious question, what you're advocating, we should be organizing communities to mobilize for, to creating a vibrant, non-Orthodox religious experience that would be compelling enough to Israelis to embolden the rural minority. And again, when it comes to the issue of the occupation, it's the Jews, many of the Jews we serve will not hear of anything other than some sort of mobilization toward what they believe looks like a step that could ultimately lead toward peace. And so, if the only option available is to align with a minority, political minority that automatically guarantees you relevance, what are you proposing we should bring to those Jews?
The first thing that I was proposing was a little understanding. And to teach that understanding. And to recognize that some of the slogans, when you're here, sound completely different. The narrative of saving Israel as a Jewish democracy, no, is completely irrelevant in Israel, and it should be. Just should be. Maybe there's another narrative. What is the narrative of the peace camp that could win here in Israel in this environment? Can't be Jewish democracy. Needs to be something else. But the peace camp has lost completely any of its moral discourse and hidden behind the Jewish democratic narrative. Because in Israel, why would you talk about your responsibility to Palestinians when you think they want to kill you? So you have to talk about it as self-interest. That self-interest, my self-interest to survive is greater than my self-interest to want a Jewish majority. I don't have, and I hear your question, I don't have the larger answer. And it's okay to get involved. Again, I'm not saying you can't get involved. I'm not saying you can't advocate for certain issues. But if you do so with a little more understanding of what happens when that narrative moves to here. Gaza was a perfect example. Perfect example. The majority of Israelis saw Gaza and demonstrations in Gaza as a war zone. Now, again, part of your job is not, I don't believe it's to convince, but sometimes when you make people aware of the fact that it's not that Israelis have become moral Neanderthals. And that's part of the narrative. It's sort of, this is, your state and religion and your kotel and your occupation. It's like everything is piled up. And all this, you don't care about it. You're just, if that narrative is stopped, then the framework within which you talk and you campaign will, I believe, be different and even heard differently. But I don't have a full answer, and I appreciate the depth of that. I do. I know that in Israeli discourse, one of the major goals of most trips to Israel now is to get those who went on the trip to at least recognize that it's complicated. We went from being we're right to it's complicated. That's not enough. This ultimately there are real issues that are dividing us. I'm hoping that if there's a little greater understanding, the nature of the division, remember, disagreement does not undermine unity or collective identity. It's how you think about the people you disagree which does. And if there could be more civil understanding about that, that's all you're going to have right now. Because as Ilana Dana, as all of us, there is nobody. When was the last time that Yesh Atid or even Gabbai went forth and spoke about the two states? It's just not talked about here. It's just not perceived as realistic. Maybe understanding why Israelis think that way, helping to understand without necessarily justifying. Maybe that's all we can have right now. Maybe that'll help a little bit. And I know fully well that it won't help in the long run. Just like I know that in the long run, a perpetuation of this occupation is going to be profoundly disruptive for Israeli society. That's all. I know you want more, but I don't have more. I'm aware of that. And I know you need more, but I don't have more. Yes, please. Last two, and then we'll end.
I want to go back to your concern about American Jewish community identified with the Democrats and include So I appreciate everything you said and everything I got from Leon said last night, and I think great insight. But I do wonder if the Israeli community is going to walk away from their Jewish community and the serious domestic and the serious constitutional issues that are important to the American Jewish community that are at our soul. And anyone is talking to them.
Yes, they are.
Without saying that we are just
Please ask, it's only part of it. Please ask Lauren or find the webinar that I gave to North American rabbis from a few months ago. That's why I didn't speak. Some of you might have seen that. But know that many of us here in Israel, we're at the Institute, we're starting an I Engage for Israelis about North American Jews with the same type of methodology, with ideas, curriculum. Already next year, it's going to be taught to teachers going into our Be'eri schools, to be moved into schools. It's going to be taught to mechinot. Already we're starting that process. And so, yes, that's the other side of the equation, which I wasn't speaking about tonight. Oh, of course it is. Oh, absolutely. I am with you. I did feel, however, that my lecture tonight was long enough. So I had to limit myself at least there. But I 100%, because if North American Jews feel that Israelis have walked away, regardless of what you do, it's going to take two to keep the Jewish people alive. That just wasn't my theme for this evening. Last question or comment, and we'll end for tonight. Yes, please.
I understand and can appreciate the bottom-up solution, but
Methodology.
Methodology at COTAP. It's going to require something to happen top-down, because right now it's hard to get to, and only a little bit of it is actually right next to the wall. So, and in Israel, things, especially there, move especially slowly, and how much patience can we be expected to have before we mobilize to get the people to do what you want? And, if I may, what is the analogous bottom-up for, I realize that a bottom-up situation is happening with marriage already, but bottom-up to make it so that it's government recognized.
Okay. Very briefly, isn't it interesting, I don't know, how all those who rejected the latest Kotel deal, the minute we thought that maybe it would be taken away, how all of a sudden it started to look so much better? Well, the building, there's 15 million shekel about to be invested. And Netanyahu is now the knight in shining armor who's going to ensure that building process over the next number of months. Now, there too again, that is more winnable. That's more winnable. That will happen. That will happen over the next number of months. I'm more frightened, not of that not happening, of it happening and remaining empty the way it is right now. But that is going to happen right now. Both Bennett and Netanyahu, They created the committee. They could have walked away. Know fully well it was so interesting that Miri Regev and Ayelet Shaked, since they know how few Israelis care about it, didn't want to spend any political capital on it, but Netanyahu was willing to. That will happen. That's going to happen over the next few months. It's not going to look like some little deck for a barbecue. They're going to be building something more significant. It won't be through the gate, through the guard gate. And then let's make it alive. As to the other, how long will it take? Welcome, excuse my French, but democracy's a bitch. It's going to take a while. You want a majority to vote? I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know if the government will ever recognize. Right now, the rabbinate is more or less dead. For anybody who doesn't want it, you bypass it. Anybody who wants it, they've lost their ability to force people. We have, in fact, people using alternative kashruts. There's so many things happening. Now, they're still there. Eventually, when there's enough people, remember, in Israeli society, look how remarkably consistent the Haredi parties are. You don't need to have a majority to win in Israel. You just need a small minority who cares about something a lot. Of those 40% who care, we have to make sure that there's 10% who care in their top 3 issues. And when that happens, legislation changes will take place. But it's not going to take place by the pink taking or the red taking over. It's going to take place within the blue. And it's a slow process. And it will take possibly decades. There is no immediate solution. There was no immediate solution to the challenge of building a state. It takes many years. It's going to take serious people, not just to build the state, but to build the state that we want. And my question to all of you, are you serious people? Laila Tov.